I suppose at the end of the day, one's identity answers the question, what are you? And, well, you can be specific. It is often expressed in the form of labels and categories that help others sort of better categorize and understand you. And this can be fine so long as it describes things that are solely the purview of your mind. Right? So, for instance, I could say I identify as an atheist. Now, I don't really actively think that. However, thinking that way is integral to me. So, making that part of my identity, I suppose, would make sense. And those who more actively care about it might be more active in their identification as such and assertion of it. Where things get weird, though, is when your identity starts making claims about reality outside of yourself. Alright? And yeah, attack helicopter meme, I know. But here's the thing. That's not even entirely wrong. Okay? For instance, think about somebody with split personality. Something happened, and in order to psychologically protect itself, the brain basically involuntarily segments itself into pieces, each of which has its own little consciousness, sort of node of consciousness that's sort of separated from the others so that, one of them can take on the burden of the trauma, and that allows it to compartmentalize the trauma, and it's how it can deal with it. And it's not up to the person this happens to what this happens, it just happens. And so what you can end up with is you can end up with multiple, independent identifying consciousnesses within one brain. And that's fine, because they are acting sort of as independent entities, even though they're still connected to each other. The segmentation has caused them to separate. Okay, fair enough. I don't have a problem with saying that there's multiple consciousnesses, multiple personalities within someone's brain. That's fine. The problem then is when they tell you who they are, because quite often they will say that, I'm a 20-year-old black man, despite the fact that they're inside the body of a, let's say, 60-year-old Asian woman or something. Now we have an assertion of identity that doesn't even make any sense, because, in this case, a consciousness is making an assertion about what it fundamentally is, even though it is not actually a body. Like, a consciousness doesn't inherently have, a racial identity or even a sex, right? It's an energy state, it's a product of a brain, and that brain is inside of a human body, which has these characteristics, but the consciousness doesn't. So, saying you identify as either a social construct or and I get that all categories are social constructs, so you do have to do that if you're going to couch your identity in terms of categories that others will understand, but you can still try to make those categories that you use related to things that are actually integral to you. But being black, right, that's not integral to your consciousness. That's a category based on physical, external characteristics that has nothing to do with your consciousness. So the idea that a consciousness identifies with that is a delusion, because those things have nothing to do with each other. Being black, being male, being a particular age, this will happen a lot with people with split personalities. They'll have each split consciousness in the brain will have its own age. You can have people that are 60, you can have people that are 6, right? These things don't make any sense on the face of it, because a consciousness is not inherently a particular age or a particular sex. These are conditions of the body that the consciousness is in, not the consciousness itself. The consciousness can be affected by physical things that happen to the body and therefore to the brain, but they're not inherent to the consciousness itself. It's a weird, like, super mind-body conflation that really isn't accurate. And I know I'm bringing this back to trans people again, but the same principle applies there. You can say, oh, I identify as female, I identify as male, despite clearly being in a body that is the opposite sex. That's a delusion, because you're not actually inherently either. What sex you are is a fact of your body, not your mind, necessarily. And maybe this is just more difficult for me because I don't identify with my sex at all. Right? It's not like I don't even possess this delusion, so I can't even really connect with the idea, like, yes, I am male. Okay, that's just a fact about the body that I'm in, to be specific. Although in everyday language we usually conflate it, so technically I'm not male, I'm in a male body, but we don't usually talk that way. We say, I am male because I am inside of a male body, and we just conflate the mind with the brain. But technically I'm not, and I don't actively identify with it either. It's just a fact. I don't really care that I'm male. Now, there are some people who do. Cis people do as well, and they're just as delusional. It's just less obvious because their identity is not in direct conflict with the body they're in. And, I suppose I could make some sort of dismissive comment that, well, if people would just realize that these identities they've cooked up for themselves in their head are just delusions, right? Then this whole problem will be solved, right? We could solve the trans problem overnight by just having people realize that they're not inherently one sex or the other, so it doesn't matter what sex they are, or to be specific, what sex their body is. It has no bearing on their mind necessarily. But that's not how this works, right? I doubt I could convince a split consciousness to reject the identities that it's assigned itself, even though they're clearly delusional and not based in reality. And I doubt I could convince someone with gender dysphoria to stop living in it either. Even if I could get them to consciously realize, yes, it's just totally all in my head, it wouldn't stop it because it's not really up to them. That's more of an unconscious thing. But I just thought it would be good to make this clear, right? Not that there's anything that can necessarily be done about it, or that anybody can be talked out of it, because there's no reasoning with this kind of thing. It's not how it works. But I thought it would be useful to clarify what's going on with this stuff, as opposed to pretending that identity trumps everything, right? If I identify as something, I am that thing, like, just period. It's what I say goes. Well, no. If your identity is related to a claim about reality, then we can check that claim against reality. And particularly with stuff that doesn't relate to stuff that's just to do with your consciousness, that is particularly possible. We can't read your mind. So if you claim you hold a particular philosophy or political ideology or whatever, nobody can prove that wrong, really, because they can't read your mind. We can try to, judge it against the evidence of what you do, but there's no real way to disprove it. But if your identity is baked into something external that doesn't have to actually do with your consciousness, and therefore is not really, doesn't even make much sense as an identity anyway, well, then we can start going, wait a minute, what do you mean you identify as that? You're not. Right? Again, attack helicopter memes, but the point still stands.